Thank you everyone for coming along this evening. We have a great turnout of people for the session, for our first session of 2021, which is really fabulous to see. Could I just remind everyone, although I managed to keep mine off while I was speaking, please could you have your microphone off while the speaker is speaking, so that there's no interference on the line and everyone can hear okay. Our speaker this evening is Gemma Smith. She's a PhD researcher from the Department of Celtic and Gaelic Studies at Glasgow University, who has for the past few years been researching the history of the northwest mainland of Scotland. She studies mainly Gaelic sources with a particular emphasis on place names. Her main interests are hills, bothies, trees, and human-animal relations. Her undergraduate research looked at the minutes of the Napier Commission's Lochinver session for evidence of how the people of Assynt viewed the changes to the landscape brought by the clearances and improvement. Her current PhD focuses on shieling landscapes of the Northwest, and today she will be talking about her master's project, a survey of the place names of Assynt. So I will hand over to Gemma, who I believe has a PowerPoint that she'd like to share for the duration of the presentation.
Sorry, 1 second. I had to unmute myself first. Okay. Is this working yet? No, it's not, is it? Hang on.
No, it came up before.
Okay. Hang on.
There we go.
There we go. Nice one. Right. Slideshow. Can everybody see this okay? Yup. Thumbs up. Excellent. Cool. Okay. Well, hello, and thanks very much to the Centre for having me today, and also to everybody who's come along. I think we've all had more than enough screen time recently, especially by this time of the day, so I really appreciate the effort, and it's lovely to see so many familiar names from Assynt there. Hopefully some nice photos here will transport us all, at least temporarily, to some happier places. And I must say it's a bittersweet occasion for me as well, being invited to talk about my favourite place in the world, somewhere that I didn't get to see nearly enough of this year. So my name's Gemma Smith, and broadly speaking, I study the ecological history of the far northwest of Scotland, focusing on place names as my main primary source. I know that most folks say environmental history, but I prefer ecological, as environmental to me implies something that's around us rather than something that we're an integral part of. So place name study is kind of innately interdisciplinary and enables you to roam freely into fields such as archaeology, ethnography, geology, botany, etc., as well as skipping backwards and forwards through time, which is one of the things I like best about it. It also helps if you like a good walk, not just a disciplinary wander, but a real life, knee deep in the bog, cursing yourself and your life choices kind of walk, as sometimes names won't make sense until you experience the actual places they refer to for yourself. My own interest in Highland history originally stemmed from walking, from tramping about various parts of the Highlands and Islands, chatting to local folk and learning from them about their area and its history. And my first visit to this area of Scotland was a very long walk from Achiltybury to Durness that I somewhat foolhardily undertook in the bitter, icy spring of 2015. I spent most of that time cold, wet and mildly terrified, but was completely Norman McCaig style possessed by Assynt in particular and determined to find out more about the place. So for those unfamiliar with the Northwest, this first slide here shows Assynt from both sides of the parish, On the left is looking north across the parish from the top of Sutherland, the watercourses on its south side delineating the southern boundary of Assynt. That's Cognac you see in the distance there. The picture on the right is taken from the opposite direction, from the Bealach on Cognac, looking south across Loch Assynt towards Sutherland. On the north side of Cognac is Loch Harn Van, Loch of the White Cairn, which marks the boundary with Edrahillis, which, by the way, is Etter da Hulis, between two Kyles, the other being the Kyle of Durness. So Assynt was particularly brutally affected by the clearances, as has been very ably documented by scholars such as Malcolm Bangor-Jones, Annie Tindley and Jim Hunter. Mere mention of the names people like Patrick Seller and the Duke of Sutherland conjures up a familiar narrative of dispossession. I'm more interested, however, in what people were doing before the clearances and so-called improvement, which is a challenge in an area with such a dearth of Gaelic sources. So many people left, taking their songs, their poetry and their folklore with them. So for my master's project, I decided to do a toponymic survey of Assynt, and it's this research that I'll be talking about tonight. So today I'm going to summarise my thesis findings by using particular places to dip into the main themes that emerged from the survey, which are, broadly speaking, geology, flora and fauna, settlement and land use, language and stories. Apologies in advance if it seems like a bit of a whistle-stop tour, because it very much is. To start with, I wanted to say a wee bit about sources and methodology. So what does a toponymic survey involve? Well, firstly, you need to spend a very long time getting to know the latest OS Explorer map of your chosen area intimately, going across it square by square, taking down all the existing place names with their grid references and classification details to give yourself a database of the head names to start with. Then you need to find all the historical versions of the names from maps and documents. So this is essentially poring over lovely maps such as this. This is Abraham Ortelius's Technicolor version of Mercator's earlier maps, this one from 1573. And trying to work out exactly what they meant by things like, for example, here you'll see almost at the centre, Gillescung. That is, of course, Culas Cuank, narrow strait, now better known as Kyle Skew, which, to be fair, is no less wacky a spelling. The first of these historic maps to include any more than a few names in this area is William Roy's Military Survey of 1747, pictured here, which gives upwards of 80 anglicised spellings of Assynt place names, but perhaps more importantly depicts things as they were arranged prior to the clearances. Note here how differently the texture of Assynt comes up in Roy's map compared with the surrounding area. As Fraser Darling attested in West Highlands Survey, this is probably the roughest, lumpiest patch of ground in the whole of Scotland. Of course, our main asset for Assynt is John Hume, spelt home, pronounced Hume's survey of 1774, which included 16 beautifully detailed maps of the farms of Assynt prior to the Sutherland Estates reorganisation. This one covers the various settlements on Restore. Hume's maps provided almost 280 early versions of some Assynt place names. The overwhelming majority of the place names I have so far collected are, however, only attested for the first time in the 1871 OS 6-inch first edition, which is in itself problematic, but I'll come to that later on. Aside from the maps, there are a handful of mentions of Assynt in documents from the 13th and 14th centuries. But the first significant source, for which I must thank Malcolm Bangor-Jones for alerting me to, is the extensive list of what it calls towns, what we would call townships, supplied by a 1681 disposition from Seaforth to Mackenzie of Assynt, which returned over 150 early forms, including, unusually, some of the earliest records of hill names, which is probably indicative of the relative importance of hill pasture for this region. For an area in which written sources are so scarce and often problematic, you need to cast your net wide. So there are also a few less conventional places in which I found what turned out to be some of the most informative evidence, which we will also come to in due course. As it stands, I now have a database of around 1,200 Assynt place names, which for an area of 36 miles from north to south and just 18 miles across its widest breadth is not bad going at all. So when you've compiled your historic versions of place names, you end up with something that looks like this. Eye candy for the onomasticians, word salad for everybody else. These are all the early forms I have for Assynt, the name of the parish itself, which in the tradition of the old statistical accounts seems as good a place to start as any. So where does the name Assynt itself come from? It's kind of a weird word, hey? Assynt. To be perfectly honest, I don't have a clue where the name Assynt comes from, but it seems that's a question that's caused sleepless nights for centuries now. The Reverend Mackenzie claims in the 1795 OSA that Assynt comes from the Gaelic as agus inche, meaning in and out, supposedly referring to its indented coastline, which sadly is just not a thing in terms of Gaelic toponymic conventions. The folkloric record, which Mackenzie dismisses, attributes it instead to the story of a battle. As he footnotes, there is a vague tradition bandied which states that two brothers, Unt and Assynt, i.e. freely translated, the man of peace and the man of discord, that they, in days of old, fought for the mastery of Assynt. The Unt was slain, of consequence the conqueror, Assynt, gave his name to the parish. And further, that imaginary spot where the scene took place was at Ryanunt, a small plain on the farm of Little Assynt. So Ryanunt, i.e. Rui and Unt, shilling of Unt, is sadly not a name attested elsewhere. However, this is Blar Nympher Mora, field, potentially battlefield of the big men, still known locally in English as the battlefield, and it is indeed a small plain on what would have been the farm of Little Assynt. Some of the recorded versions of this story on Tober and Dúlacus have this as the location of the battle, and variously have the protagonists as two boys, the first Celts in the area, or even as sons of Sieur Torcal disputing ownership of the land. So these tales are clearly retrospective attempts to rationalise name for which the original meaning has been lost. The current orthodoxy is that Assynt is Old Norse as, pole, main rafter, metaphorically a ridge, plus endi, end, as suggested by W.J. Watson, which at first didn't really make much sense to me, but if you look at it this way, from the north-easterly direction from which the north approached the area, Assynt is indeed the ridge end of the country, and it maybe raises questions as to exactly what extent of the northwest the name originally applied to. The problem with this one, as with all of the ON possibilities, is they all involve a long A at the start, whereas the Gaelic pronunciation is Asynche, with no additional stress on the first syllable. So this is all very much still up for debate. If we look back to our early forms, what fascinates me the most of these really early ones here, the first two from Bagimon's rule, and the second from the MacLeod Charter. In the first, there's some debate as to whether or not this would have been pronounced a hard C, askend, but this second one, askinkche, is just curious. Without another early document turning up, I doubt we will ever really know. So the dramatic landscape of Assynt inspires these elemental stories, battles between peace and disorder. See also versions of the story about MacLeod trying to marry his daughter off to the devil, that have the devil retaliating with rocks from the sky or by shifting the ground. In the Enlightenment era, this landscape moved the early geologists to consider the origins of the earth itself. Said Thomas Pennant in his 1772 tour of Scotland, "I never saw a country that seemed to have been so torn and convulsed. The shock, whenever it happened, shook off all that vegetates. Among these aspiring heaps of barrenness, the Sugarloaf Hill of Slovine made a conspicuous figure. At their feet, the blackness of the moors by no means assisted to cheer our ideas." He's also echoed there by William Roy. The romanticised, exaggerated illustrations of the Highland landscape from this period are in Assynt not actually far removed from the real thing. This is William Daniels' illustration of Cailscú, and my own picture of the same view across the loch to what's known as the dark side of Cuniac. some lovely ponies in the foreground. So with my apologies to geologists, put very simply, the island of Britain was formed after the collision of the continents of Laurentia and Avalonia over 400 million years ago, which displaced huge slices of rock 70 kilometres west and left a ribbon of sandstone from Loch Carron up to the north coast. The impact of this cast up the mountains of the Highlands, and Assynt is essentially one of the places where the scars, or what are known as thrust belts, show most vividly, which is what attracted geologists to the area and informed so many of their discoveries. So, Clachary, that's where it is on the coast of Ruastore, with John Hume's map on the top right. And this is its striking red sandstones looking their most glamorous in golden hour one lovely night in August last year. It's the rock formations around here that led to the discovery of the meteorite crater in the Minch just a few years ago. And this is what, oh, sorry, wrong one. This is what some people will have you believe Clachary is named after, from a clach hul, as it appears on the OS, said to mean holestone. The first issue here is that that's not really a holestone, is it? I think that's quite clearly a clach sculpture, or a split rock. The Reverend Mackenzie's answer to this in the OSA is that it was in fact at one point an actual stone arch that has since collapsed in a storm. I think he's getting that though from a Coniuch O'r story, the Brahman seer, who predicted the collapse of a natural stone arch on Ruastore. Hume's map certainly depicts the split rock in 1774, and there is still a natural stone arch intact just around the coast at Culkeenstore. Additionally, the forms of the split rock align with the similarly angled shelves of rock that make up the headland, suggesting a dramatic shift somewhere in the midst of geological time. The second issue is grammatical. We would really expect to see clachhul for whole of the stone. If it was actually clachtol or clachhol, that would be a close compound indicating a name of some antiquity. I would suggest that the specific element could perhaps instead be tool, and that a clachhul actually means floodstone. There is additionally a term listed by Dwelly, clachhul, meaning a hollowed out stone or a magic stone. Magic stones often reported as having a hole in them like Coniuch O'r. But what would this name refer to? Well, there is also this. Through this wee blowhole lies a sea cave with floods and stormy conditions spouting water through the hole, which has been turfed over by successive generations of crofters so the sheep don't fall through it. And this is what the local oral tradition claims as the source of the name. That's it just at the bottom right of that picture there. So it looks like this more hidden feature may indeed be a clachhul. If we look at the early forms, I hope the locals will be pleased to see that I have designated Flossies as the absolute epicentre of clachhul. The very earliest ones start in 1592 with clachhul, then in 1654 Clochoil. It's only from 1681 that we see clachhul or clachhol, as in Roy's Bal Clachenhol in 1747, with clachtol subsequently becoming the standardised version. So this dramatic and diverse geology of Assynt, which is illustrated beautifully here in this geological survey map, gives rise to huge diversity in flora and fauna, as is evidenced by the hundreds of place names referencing plants and animals. This is the area to the west of Loch Assynt around Inchlandaff, Meadow of the Stags, a place where you are more likely to see deer than not, despite modern developments such as the hotel and bunkhouse. This is likely to owe something to the underlying geology, as this area is interjected with sheets of igneous rock, particularly rich in sodium and potassium, which the deer will be naturally drawn to. And here we can see some of them hanging about of an evening at what surely was the Inishlandaff itself, which subsequently became the gleblands of the old parish church, the historic settlement latterly known as Kirkton, that we can see here on Timothy Pont's map depicting the area around Ardwick Castle. There are a huge variety of plants and trees included in the toponymic record. As you might expect, things that are useful or edible feature heavily, like willow, hawthorn, various berries, wild garlic, etc. But we can also use place names to trace historic tree cover. Although a lot of the place names with a tree name as the specific element, dendrotoponyms if you will, would have been landmarks and so don't necessarily indicate lots of trees. A woodland generic element such as Durra or Collier obviously does. So to me, one of the most interesting names on this map, as Pont has it, is Halliemore or Colliemore. As we can see on the OS map here, survived by Droim na Colliemore, the ridge of the Great Wood just to the south of Calder House. There's no Collier there now, and no trees at all really until you get to the churchyard at Inchnadamth. It also appears on Robert Gordon's map from 1636, but according to Hume's map, the wood was gone by 1774. So what we know about the Colliemore is that it disappeared at some point between 1636 and 1774, and that it was located next to Calder House, the first classical mansion in the northwest, built by the Mackenzies. So the Sutherland estate is quite justly vilified for their actions in Assynt, but when it comes to the depletion of woodlands, I suspect it's the Mackenzies who perhaps deserve closer scrutiny. So, onto the beasts. Here's another stag. They tend to pop up everywhere in the northwest. Look at his wee shadow in that picture, isn't it lovely? It won't be a surprise to anyone who knows the area to hear that deer are by far the most widely attested animal in the place names of Assynt. The deer have always been there, or at least since the end of the last ice age allowed it. According to Clown Nichal legend, who held the parish before the MacLeods, they were gifted Assynt by the ancient Thanes of Sutherland, who used it as a deer forest. The topography suits the deer well and has always given them plenty of places to hide. Now, we can't take animal place names too literally. It doesn't necessarily follow that there was twice as many actual deer. It could be that a place was named because of a story about an animal. To give one slightly macabre example, Andrew Wiseman's articles about Tuggerum and cat, a method of divination that involved burning a cat in order to summon the king of cats, who was apparently happy to answer your questions, show that a lot of cat place names involved such a story and usually indicated the place in which the cat was flung afterwards to extinguish the flames. In Assynt, there is a crag of the cat, just north of Store, that would lend itself to such a tale. If a place name did refer to a story about an animal, though, it does still suggest that this was a place in which you might expect to find such an animal, and it certainly attests to their cultural significance. By naming a place after them, you are giving them a place in your universe. So among domestic animals, cows are overwhelmingly the most widely attested beast. Even disregarding shilling names and the like, there are again twice as many cow names as there are any other domestic animal. So this photo is taken on the way up to the Bealach on Cognac, Bealach Horny on the 2007 OS, Pass of the Folding Cloth. Strange, but then on the 1871 OS 6-inch first edition, it's actually Bealach Hornich, Pass of the Coil, I would say referring to the great curls of rock that make up the hill, which historically would have provided sheltered summer pastures for folks' cattle. This bit here, between Sal Goram and Sal Garav, as we can see in Hume's depiction, is a hollow flat called the Byre of Cognac, or Bahi Cognac in Gaelic, indicating a place where cattle were kept. There's also a hill called Umbaha in Glen Shiel. Cognac is, of course, a Huniac, the milk pail, I think referring to its purpose rather than its shape, in the same way as, say, Bain Im in Argyll, Butter Mountain, is named for the produce that came down from its quarries in the summer, rather than because it looked like a pat of butter. More surprising, perhaps, to us is the number of goat place names, which are at least equal to those in sheep. As I said, you can't translate them directly into actual animals, but in this case, the pre-improvement statistics from the OSA and the Board of Agriculture surveys roughly correspond. So these fabulous beasties here. Goats were kept by the ordinary folk rather than the elites, so really poorly documented, and it's only really the place names that give an indication of their significance. As you might expect, you find goat names in hillier areas, and often at the outer extent of shealing grazings, as goats occupied the rockiest heights and acted as an adjunct to herd management, stopping sheep from wandering too far and often seeing off outside threats such as foxes. A final wildcard in Assynt's zootoponyms is this one, Altvahain, Bear Burn, one of two place names featuring bears in the parish, which as far as I know are the only bear names in Scotland. Yes, that does say CCTV in operation. It's for monitoring mink. The other bear name is very close to here. This is one of Assynt's famous bone caves, where the only polar bear bones in the UK were found in the 1920s, along with brown bears, reindeer, ox, wolves, and Arctic fox and lemming. This one is now known by cavers and tourists as Badger Cave. About half a mile to the north is a hill called Croch-Gaelic-Bahain. Hill of the hind of the bear, hill of the she-bear. Semantically and grammatically odd, right enough, but halfway up Benmore Assynt and surrounded by caves, certainly somewhere it's not hard to imagine bears dwelling. Bears only actually went extinct in the UK sometime after 800 AD, so it's entirely plausible that these names refer to real bears. And if there was a last bear in the country a millennium or so ago, my money would certainly be on it having haunted the hills and caves of Assynt. So, having set the scene and accounted for the non-human inhabitants of the parish, what about the people who lived here? We know that they lived in a rugged and hilly place where wee scattered woodlands and patches of fertile soils existed, where geology and exposure allowed, in the many dips, creases and furrows of the land. We know that they were surrounded by a great variety of flora and fauna, and that deer and cattle were of particular significance to them. So how might they have inhabited this place? As we know, prior to clearance and improvement, Highland folk lived in B. Balchin, like we can see here on the left. This is John Hume's map of the old Clashmore village before the estate made it into their model farm, as shown on the right on the US First Edition. That didn't end well for them, needless to say. There were riots in the 1860s that apparently deterred them from attempting any further major improvements. And here is what would have been Clashmore Main Street, running through the ruins of part of the old village. This is just unmarked ruins on the OS, and not something I would ever have known about had I not been shown it by local pals. There's only a couple of Bala settlement names in the whole of Assynt and just a few Achags. The settlement names on the whole are reflective of the shape of the land, often described as a Crochan Islochan landscape, with Powl, meaning hollow, and Bat, clump or place, being the most common generic elements. Some larger settlements, like this one, were deemed a clash, a furrow, and some of what were the larger inland settlements are based around a lehet, a slope, like Leadbeg and Leadmore, a well-drained sloping field being a prized spot in an area with such high rainfall. Peter May, who mapped Coigach in 1758, appealed to his sponsors for a tent, as folks' houses were so far apart that he and his guides often found themselves without shelter at night. It would have been very similar in Assynt, with each little habitable hollow only able to support a few families at most. So this is one of my favourite little hollows I've found so far, and he's only actually named in Hume's map of Glenleirig. He has it as Auchenloth Shieling, or Achagan Lohich, field of the slope. That this toty wee piece of grass was considered an achag, I think tells you all you need to know. And also it being an achag on a lowhitch makes me wonder if it was always just a shieling. Shieling are what I'm looking at for my PhD now, and one thing that's become obvious so far though is that not all shieling names contain the shieling generic elements Ari or Rui. In fact, only probably about half of them do. They more often have topographic names, lots of alps, lots of corras, for example. There certainly seems though to be a folk memory around Kilkeenway of people having once lived up at the base of Cognac. That's something that's come up in a few stories I've been told. And it was something also reported by Ronald Miller in his 1961 article on Highland Shieling. It worked the other way around as well. This is Clachary, or stone shieling, which nestles in this amazing wee spot. Don't listen to Reverend Mackenzie. It's not a gloomy hollow, it's a lovely place. Almost right in the centre of the parish, just where the path up Sutherland cuts off what Reverend Mackenzie tells us is the Edravine Road from Etter da Vine, between two mountains, those mountains being Sutherland and Canisp. Ari indicates a dairying site, but according to the OSA, Clachary was permanently inhabited in 1795. It's also cited in a list of 50 cleared townships that Crofter Kenneth Campbell read out to the Napier Commission in 1883. And that in itself is also a really important source as to how things changed after the state took over. So in an area with so little arable land, folk lived by their animals, and in the northwest, shielings were just as important as the home bala. Reverend Mackenzie's delineation of the farms of Ruastor makes clear that each farm included a hinterland of peat roads and shielings and lochans stretching into the interior of the parish. There are travellers' accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries that reference the exceptional dairy produce of the region, and the Agricultural Survey of 1815 says also that Assynt cattle were considered the best of all the Highland breeds. The shieling practice enriched the land as much as the beasts, with some sites becoming so improved by manuring over time that the land became cultivable. Like some of these sites, like Clachary here, became permanent habitations. So people lived all over the land here in all its nooks and crannies, and they moved all over it too. Hume's maps show a network of old roads crisscrossing the interior of the parish. Their beasts were nourished by the various pastures, and they spread both fertiliser and seed behind them. And the people benefited from the natural rhythm that the seasonal flittings brought to their lives and the movement up to the shielings in the summer months. Centuries of experience and attentiveness to their surroundings resulted in a delicately balanced, dynamic system that had the capacity to expand and contract to meet the demands of the current population within flexible boundaries that respected the needs of neighbouring communities, both human and non-human, as the changing toponymic landscape evidenced by the early documentary sources shows. This is not to try and conjure up some kind of utopian picture, just to acknowledge that folk with what Tim Ingold calls inhabitant knowledge used to just make it work, as they continue to do now. There's a great line in the notes of the Napier Commission from the firebrand Reverend Norman Mackay when he says of the improvers, "These gentlemen walked along the road and they saw the land. They did not go over the land. They did not know it intimately like the folk who worked it every day of their lives." So that is the environment and human settlement, and now I'll go into language. This was the biggest surprise I got from the whole survey. When I started this project, I assumed I'd need to study some Old Norse and was really disappointed that the course wasn't running that year, but really I needn't have worried. These are all the place names in Assynt of potentially Norse origin. Shine. 16, 17, including the name Assynt itself, out of 1,200 names. So for anyone familiar with the onomastic and antiquarian literature of the 19th century, this might come as a surprise as well, as historians of that era seemed very keen to attribute most things of note in Sutherland to the Vikings. Sadly, I don't have time to run through all of these today, and we'll just have to cut to the chase. The onomasticians among you will probably have noticed already that these names are mostly topographic, that is, they apply to landscape features. Chalagal and the lochs are at the eastern boundaries of the parish. The caldas from the Old Norse kelda, spring, are near Ardfret Castle and are also Norse-Gaelic compounds, which could be significant. The others are either islands or coastal features in the west, and the two hills are probably the most visible ones from the sea. The point is that there are only 2 settlement generics among them, which is just weird if you compare it to the place names of, say, Lewis, just across the Minch, which is full of setters and bosts and all manner of Norse elements. In Assynt, all there is Unapool, which Peder Gameltoft has as potentially underball, under below farm, indicating a secondary settlement. Similarly, Drumsurdeline here, as you can see from all my photos, by the way, the sun always shines in Assynt. Drum being the Gaelic ridge, Surdeline the name of the nearby farm, which was cleared in the early 19th century for the incoming sheep farmer John Scobie to build his house on, and is now the site of Glencanis Lodge. Surdeline is from the Old Norse forder, turf and land, indicating a field that could be farmed. Land is, as Inga Sarheim's research has shown, a very early settlement generic and also indicates a secondary settlement. So where might we have found a primary Norse settlement in Assynt? My guess would be Store. If we look at the satellite image here, we can see that Ruastor has way more arable land than anywhere else on the coast. See all the wee green spots there. Several sheltered harbours on both sides of the headland, and just importantly, I think it has this advantage. This is a view from Bain and Rickaden, Mountain of the Watchman or Guard, an unremarkable wee lump just at the start of the Store Peat Road that only takes about 10 minutes to get to the top of, but nevertheless commands the most extraordinary view over the Minch from the hills of Torridon in the south, past through Aquayac, over to the Western Isles and right up to Handa Island in the north, and the view inland is just extensive if you turn around there. My friend Mary Hinsley from Store told me that folks say that you've never been able to come into Assynt by boat without anybody noticing, and with viewpoints like that, I quite believe it. If you were after a strategic location from which to colonise Assynt, you could do an awful lot worse. Store, again, is a topographic name from the Norse store, stake, suggesting a very early settlement. The feature referenced by the name is, of course, the Old Man of Store, previously known in Gaelic as the Bot, the penis of Store, here depicted shamelessly by Hume. Sorry, I maybe should have issued a content warning for this slide. The first mention of Store is actually the earliest recorded Assynt place name. In chapter 94 of the Orkneyinga saga, this is the point at which Svein Aslifson tells his men to down oars and hoist the sails. It was actually Orkneyinga that first got me thinking about Norse-Gaelic contact in the northwest, because despite marauding all over Caithness, all over Sutherland, which at that time, by the way, was only ever eastern part, Sutherland, the bit south of Caithness, and the Western Isles, they never seemed to set foot west of Oikel Bridge on the mainland, and there's only one other mention of Assynt in the whole thing. This is Porscheanthony, harbour of the Swede, so called as a related folktale tells us, as it is where the heart of a Swedish prince called Spenno was buried after being killed by locals. This is on the south side of Loch Harn. If you're ever brave enough to drive the Drumbeg Road, it's just before you get to Kylsku. Funnily enough, this is very close to where Orkneyinga situates a battle between Svein Aslifson and a mysterious and deeply Gaelic sounding figure called Gili Oran, meaning follower of St. Oran of Iona, presumably, in a battle on what it delightfully calls Murky Fjord, better known to us as Loch Glendu, Loch of Glendu, the Dark Glen. This story is also related by the Icelandic historian Torfaus. Obviously, we can't treat folklore and sagas as historical texts, but the toponymic evidence certainly suggests that any Norse settlement in this area was early and short-lived, which I think supports Andrew Jennings' hypothesis in his 2017 article that the northwest mainland was not part of the territory ceded by King Edgar of Scotland to King Magnus of Norway in the 11th century, and that this part of the Scottish mainland was what the Norse called Scotland's Fjordur, Scotland's fjords, and the Gaels Erigala Tua, North Argyll. As far as I know, the most northerly extent of Erigala Tua yet proposed was Torridon, I think by Ian Fraser. I would go a good bit further than that and suggest that it actually stretched at least as far as Durness, if not all the way around Strathnaver. So the story about the death of Sveno is one of many in a wonderful two-part article from 1888 called The Folklore of Sutherlandshire. The writer, Miss Dempster, was a member of the landowning family Dempster of Skibo and was a Gaelic speaker herself. Her articles are one of the best sources we have for some of these place name stories, as the Ordnance Survey name books contain hardly any such information for Assynt. For Sutherland, they seem to be dominated by a Reverend Joas, who, although a Gaelic speaker, was not from the area, and as with many antiquarians of his time, was a little too keen on ascribing everything to the Norse. We see this also with the Reverend Mackenzie, who is clearly Ossian daft. It was 1795, to be fair, but at one point he claims that the Power Stone of Loda was housed in a cairn on Alderney Island. And that is the problem when incoming authority figures start imposing their own stories, right? By the 19th century, often these stories were already coming from popular books rather than from the oral tradition, and the original stories become obscured. There's a few more stories come up in Otis Wyer's The Highlands and Their Legends, and there's the odd one in more random sources like John Hicks' Angler's account from 1855, wandering by the lochs and streams of Assynt, which incidentally is up on archive.org and is really worth a look. He seemed to take a real interest in the people. There's only a handful of Gaelic speakers, native Gaelic speakers left in Assynt, some of whom I've had the great pleasure and privilege of chatting to. And from the unrecorded names and stories they've mentioned to me, it breaks my heart to think how much is already lost. Ultimately, what I'm interested in is perception and what place names can tell us about how folk perceived their environments. And I think the main impression I got from my study was that this was a world where there was a place for everybody, from the clegg to the eagle, from the pine marten to the wolf. And not only were non-humans given their place in the landscape, they were given their own stories too, in which they usually display a remarkable degree of agency. We heard earlier about the king of the cats, who knew all the secrets. Well, there was also an otter king in Assynt, and in Miss Dempster's article, there's a group of stories about the fox, who seems to occupy a kind of trickster role, similar to the coyote in some Native American traditions. I'd venture that some of these may have been attached to the numerous fox place names in Assynt and elsewhere in the Highlands. Essentially, it seems to me that this was somewhere where all beasts, human and otherwise, were all entangled in this place together. So, finish with another bonny photo of the hills. That's what we're all here for, really, right? This is from the top of Coolmore, looking north. Here we can see Sullivan and Canis, Petuniac in the middle there, and in the very distance, Arkle and Foinavan up in Idrihillis. I must apologise for really just skimming the surface tonight. I would love to have talked for the whole time about various plants and their uses, or about folklore and the supernatural. I could easily fill an hour with the Norse-Gaelic language contact story. And I could talk for a very long time indeed about all the things revealed by place names that just aren't evidenced anywhere else. caves, settlements, places of worship, maybe even some hidden rocks. But hopefully this has at least given a hint of the potential of place names to shed light on the rich human and non-human history of parts of Scotland erroneously perceived by many as wilderness. So thank you for listening, and Slanchpa.
Thanks so much, Gemma. There's lots of little claps coming up in the bottom of the screen.
Cool.
Screen as appreciation, as it's very hard to clap over the microphone. So I think that was very much enjoyed by everyone. And I think the best way to approach questions today, on the basis that we have so many people on the call this evening, would be for people to post their names in the chat if they'd like to ask a question. So the chat is on the right hand side. You should have a little button that you can press to bring the chat up. So if you'd be interested in asking a question, if you'd like to type your name into the chat, and then we'll try and get around to as many people as we can.
Cool.
Okay, there's a question. There's a question come up in the chat then from Ian about Ordnance Survey in Gaelic. Would you like to come in, Ian?
Might as well show you what I look like too. My name is Owen. I'm Irish. The Ordnance Survey in Ireland used two of the finest Gaelic scholars in the country, John O'Donovan and Eugene Curry, to help with Gaelic place names. Did the same happen in Scotland with Gaelic? Thanks.
I think it varies from area to area. The ministers feature quite heavily. I think in Assynt, certainly the ones that I've looked at closely, there seems to be that there's only a couple of sources for each name, which is quite unusual. They tended to look for more than that. I know that I was kind of down on Reverend Joas getting too involved with it all, but I'm not sure if he maybe might have been the transcriber, because obviously there would have been a lot of folk who could speak Gaelic but wouldn't have been able to write it. So that, I mean, that might be why he was so heavily involved. To be honest, it's really under-researched. We were talking about this in an onomastics reading group I go to, that somebody really needs to start looking into that in a Scottish context. I don't think it's been as researched as in Ireland, so I'm not sure. The research hasn't been done, basically.
Thanks very much. I think we've got a question from Vicky Cliff.
Just unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
I'm Robert Cliff. Just that we got a house in Ballydarroch, and what the significance of the och and the ak ending is, or is it just an accident of history?
It's just different phonetic ways of spelling it. I mean, I suppose that that's vowel sound in Gaelic is kind of halfway between an O and an A, so it's just come out slightly differently. It's not really a significant spelling difference, to be honest. It doesn't mean anything. It's just different ways of transcribing it, really. I
see. So it's just a historical transcription, because the road signs have both. You drive, one's got ak, the next sign's got ok, and then so there's complete consistency locally as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's ak in Gaelic, isn't it? I think ok is just a kind of slightly anglicised version, but it doesn't really matter if it sounds the same.
So what should we use, ac or oc, to be correct?
Well, ac is the Gaelic. Go with the Gaelic.
Okay.
Go with the ac.
I'll use ac. Okay, thank you.
No bother.
Then we have a question from Ian Mackay. We can't hear you, Ian. I can ask your question if you like, because you typed it in. Were there any signs of Pictish place names, Gemma?
It's hard to tell. I mean, the vast majority in Assynt are Gaelic. I think probably the best contenders for Pictish names are the river names. There's a couple of river names from way back that come up in early documents. For the River Inver and the River Culag were apparently the Abrud and the Astra, which are, I mean, they don't sound very Gaelic. Abrud could be, maybe, it could be an Aber something. I'm not sure. It's not, I don't really look at Brittonic, and it's not something I'm not particularly strong in medieval languages, to be honest. So, I'm probably not the best person to ask about it. I would say they're probably the main contenders. But there is, yeah, it is. I mean, the one kind of take home from it is that it's really overwhelmingly Gaelic. Again, I'm not 100% sure as to what that means, but I'd like to work it out eventually.
Thanks very much. I think we've got a question from Rory McLean.
Hi there.
Hi, Rudy.
That was terrific. The sound wasn't on for me, so I hope you maybe covered this. But it was Alderney Island, which looks Norse. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on its derivation, and also around about it, there's lots of little tiny islands named for goats, Ilan and Goa and Ilan and Boch, Skin and Meow and Bone and Meow. And I'm just wondering. And you have any thoughts? Because it's not just Assynt, it occurs in other places too. Yeah,
it's a funny one, isn't it? Boas seem to be named after animals quite a lot. I found that, not just goats, but I do wonder if maybe they look like animals sometimes, and that was maybe something for sailors, you know? I'm not sure. I just seem to remember discussing that at an onomastic convention with somebody once. But Alderney Island is a really interesting one, and it's an absolute headache. I mean, the ending on it obviously suggests a Norse island name, but there's so many possibilities in Norse of what the old bit could be. You know, there's lots of different words. However, the worst thing about Alderney Island is there's a note in James Locke's published papers that says what he's talking about Ferragar Leochia in it, and about, you know, he was gifted physician to David II, I want to say. He was gifted all the islands from Restore right up to Tongue, apparently. And it's talking about that, and it says Alderney Island used to be called Jura. There is a note in my affairs explaining why, and obviously under current restrictions I've not managed to get to the records office to try and find this note, but like, this keeps me up at night. Alderney Island was called Jura. I mean, the thing about that, I mean, presumably Jura, it would be Deer Island in Norse, same as the other Jura, but why would it change from one Norse name to the other in living memory? You know, I just, yeah, I mean, that one, Alderney Island is a headache. Frankly, I'm not quite sure. I think it's really interesting how similar it is to Alderney, though, eh? And Alderney was famous for cattle as well. Alderney cattle are wee black cattle. I don't know if I'm just like joining up dots here, where I want to see them joined up, but it might have something to do with it. I thought the most likely one I came up with, there's an element, is it Alidir, I think, in Old Norse that means livestock, particularly cattle. But I seem to remember Simon Taylor telling me, no, that was a load of rubbish. So yeah, I'm not sure, but thanks for bringing it up.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. We've got a question from Malcolm Bangor-Jones, who would like me to read it out because he says his connection is rubbish. So we have the place Little Assynt, but where is Big Assynt?
I know, that's a pain as well. Oh, I've got a memory of somebody telling me this at one point. I'm not sure if maybe it was if it maybe means like Assynt, like the main bit of Assynt. Maybe the main bit was down at Ardrech, and then Little Assynt was just up the road, you know. But yeah, that's another one that I'm not 100% sure why that came about. Interestingly, also in Loch Assynt, you've got two beg and two more as well, don't you? Which is that will come from Tuv Bake and Tuv More, the big side and the wee side, and these were settlements on either side of the loch. So again, that's curious. What makes them big? What makes them the small one? There's another element that really bothers me. Showns. When you see shown come into places, it means old. Like, what makes it old, right? The most famous one, I think, Shenaval. I know that's not an Assynt, but Shenaval Bothy, everybody knows Shaunavala, the old town. Sandwood is that as well. Shaunavat, the old place. There's one in Assynt that's on the current OS map. It's just at the back of Ned, and it comes up as Anchenrich. And I was like, that's not even a word. If you look at the OS 6-inch first edition, it's in Chaun Arach, which means the old battlefield. Again, what made it an old battlefield? This is one of these things that nobody's actually studied. You know, somebody needs to do like a full study of that specific element, Chaun, to work it out. But again, it's wide open. Nobody's done it yet. So.
Thanks very much. Next question would be over to David.
Yeah, I'd like to edit my question really, but yeah, thanks very much. A really excellent talk. I was just wondering about the proportion of shoreside settlements as opposed to inland settlements and how that compared with other parts of the North Islands.
Well, I mean, pre-clearance, folk were dotted all over Assynt, you know, and then there's very good maps in Malcolm Bangor-Jones' wee book on the Assynt clearances that show how the clearances how they all moved to the coast. It wasn't always that way. I mean, I know there was lots of people put into Lead Beg, I think, at the start as well. Before that was totally cleared. So yeah, I mean, they were dotted about where they could live, you know. I think the best bits of land determined that. Most of the ones at the shore, obviously Ruastor was much more heavily inhabited than further down because it's a big old lump of sandstone attached to all the Louisian gneiss, so it's much better land. But the most populous part pre-clearance was down what is known as the Limestone Valley, down Leadbeg, Leadmore, up that way, inland, as with much of the rest of the Highlands.
Okay, and then we have an observation from Eleanor Gwynn. Hi, Eleanor, can you hear us? I might just move on to the next one, which is Hugh Cheap. Would you like to come in, Hugh?
Hello, sorry.
Hi, Hugh.
Couldn't work the technology. It was just a comment to thank Gemma very much for that wonderful, wide-ranging talk. And ich graag misje fachl na gan Gaelic, maar biocha, vaich o taring yo cho biocha, mille taingu.
Tang voor is Jim. Tang voor. It's my Aiken.
I think that we've been through all the questions that people had posted in the chat. I'm aware that some people may not have the chat function, so I did just want to give people an opportunity to come in if they would like to, ask a question, but couldn't put their name into the chat.
Yeah, go unmute, not.
Oh, I think we had another question actually just come into the chat box from Murray Anderson. Did you pick up any non-map names on your wanders from locals, names of fields and lochs, etc.?
I've got a few, yeah. I mean, sadly, I've not been able to spend much time up there as I'd like to over the past year. But previous to that, yeah, I got a few. Angady is good for a story or two. Is that Murray as in Carolina and Murray? Don't know, is he out there? I think so. Anyway, I think Murray lives in Store, so he'll know exactly who I'm talking about. He told me a really good one about there's a rock next to the lighthouse up at Store called Skeer of Auchan, which is it's like rock of the ghost. And he said the story was there was a lighthouse keeper and he was warned about this ghost and told that if he shot him through the heart with him, you need to put a silver threepenny bit behind the bullet in your gun. Shot him with a silver threepenny bit, then that's how to get rid of him. And this is what happened. And the ghost apparently went tumbling off the cliff, and the bit that he fell off at is known as Skeer of Auchan. But there's loads. I mean, I mean, they know everything. You know, the boutique up in Store have names for stuff all over the place, and from what they've said, I'd imagine that what is on the OS is probably at most half of the actual place names that did exist, you know, which is really sad. There's an awful lot of them that are blank. But there's a lot that are getting new names. I saw Claire Bellshot out there, if you don't mind me telling your wee story, Claire. There's an unnamed wee hill over the road from her croft that she has christened Carn and Lug, which is cairn of the calves, because that's where her cows go to give birth. So that's lovely, and I would encourage anyone in Assynt, if there's an unnamed feature, to give it one yourself, you know, rename all those features.
Thanks very much. Were there any further questions that people would like to ask Gemma before we wrap up the session? Oh, I've got another one here about from Elsa, which is the geology of Assynt is incredibly famous. Are there any names that connect specifically to the geological features?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, they're descriptive anyway. I mean, there's lots of ruag, that's red, kind of sandstone comes up. There's Leah comes up, it's kind of silver, and you know that comes up referring to limestone. Elfin is Fune white stone in reference to the limestone around about there. Some of the hill names as well. I think Corrival is a really interesting one. Corrival is at Honuville, which is the meeting hill. And I think that's got to do with the shape of it. I think that's named from the top. you know? Otherwise, how else would you know that that's the point at which all the ridges meet? So, yeah, I suppose that they're reflective. There's one as well, there's a Beinn opposite Inchnaddamp, and that's Rough Mountain, and it's the site of like a double or triple geological non-conformity. So yeah, I mean, there's certainly. I mean, I think the geology of Assynt was always remarkable. You know, I think everybody who's lived there has always, you know, looked around and gone, wow. And I think that comes across in the name, certainly.
Thanks very much. I think Rory wanted to add something about Gemma's comment on the two Assynt bears.
Rory, give us the gen on the bear names.
Just in case if people are interested. Yeah, I was like you, Gemma, until very recently. I thought the only two bear toponyms in Scotland were in Assynt. So I decided to look into it, and I found 4, possibly 5 others. So it's 6 going on to 7, perhaps, all but 1 in Gaelic. So I'll write that in my Nature Scot blog next month. So I'm just doing a little bit more research. But
what element are they using in it though? Because
it's Mag-Alna, and that's what I was going to say. I think the Assynt ones are more modern because they're using the element Mahan for a bear, but the older Mag-Alna appears in some other parts of the country. So I think Assynt is a good bet on the basis of the very scant knowledge of place names that it might have been the last place to have them. But it wasn't the only place that's got that.
That's super interesting, because I'd looked at that and I'd seen there are a lot of names that come up with Gawain in it, and I was like, why? Because it's the genitive case is obviously Gauna, so I wonder if they are maybe Gawain as well. Don't know.
I don't know, but there are a few, so it's really interesting to see echoes of animals that were once with us that are no longer. Yeah, but a fascinating talk. Thanks very much.
No bother, thank you.
I think there might be another question from Ryan.
Oh, go on. What are you saying, Geodovitz?
Well, it's not a question, but just that when I was looking at the folktales and the Dewar manuscripts, there was one story, and I can't remember who it was about, but it was, you know, one of the big figures on the Jacobite side at Culloden, and after the fight, he retreated back to his family home, and he found it burnt down to the ground basically, and I think maybe in the embers, a she bear was walking through with her cubs, but they spared him. As in, the bear didn't attack him. So yeah, historically, I'm not sure how much weight that carries, but I'll try to find it and I'll send it to the both you and to Rory if you like.
It's a bit of a digi story, isn't it?
Yeah, probably.
Is that right?
I'm going to ask one if I can.
Was that someone wanting to come in to ask a question?
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks very much, Ian. Go ahead.
Vati, wolf names, or fox or dog. Vati to the west of Sutherland. And there are a lot of Courier Vatis. I probably don't pronounce it correctly, but
that's okay.
What does Gemma think of the possibility? They're always in very remote places. Vati names, MHA. Well, she knows the word.
Funnily enough, wolves are the second most commonly attested wild animal. Just putting that out there. Don't want to get political about it. But yeah. And funnily enough, the Coryavadis that you mentioned are they are down in the OSA. He talks about them being disputed grazings. So perhaps ruminants and wolves are not as incompatible as some people would have you believe. Yeah, they do come up quite a lot. The one, funnily enough, though, the one at the south of Sutherland, I've heard that called Fox Glen in English by local folk. So it might have been a Vadi Rug, and maybe that's gone, and it's only survived in the English. There's not really any way known without finding an earlier version of it. So that one's kind of, that could be either, really.
Mm.
There's also the names that come up with Con. I think it's the Ledbeg River. The original name of the Ledbeg River was Avainacon, according to the OSA. So there's some dog names come up as well. As I said, I mean, everything's there. You know, everybody's in there. If you can think of it, it's there. I mean, I said Clegg. There is literally a place named after Cleggs. There's a field named after snails. Everybody comes up. You know, everybody gets their own wee patch.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Anybody who has walked through to Glenavati, how far it is from either side, it is so remote. I cannot believe that it would have a fox name. There are foxes everywhere. You know.
Back in the day, though, was it? That was one of the main roads across the parish. And there was actually a settlement right there where you see Uia Cardiff, that's forward of the Smith. That was actually a settlement. Somebody lived there, and that was on the main road. And there's a few other little places dotted along there, ruins of settlements. So it wasn't always remote. That used to just be where people went, you know.
Thanks very much, everyone, for your wonderful questions. And thank you again to Gemma for her splendid paper this evening, kicking off the History Talks Live for 2021 in spectacular form. I've got to say thank you very much, Gemma. And thank you, everyone, for coming along. Ian, do you have the date of the next talk?
Thank you for putting me on the spot, Lucy. No, I don't, but I can. Yeah, no, I'm afraid I don't. It will be next month sometime, roughly 3 weeks from now.
It's Thursday, the 4th of March.
Thank you very much, Nicola. So our next talk will be on Thursday, the 4th of March. You can find more information about the talks on the website as normal. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. It's been a wonderful turnout this evening, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thanks very much for coming along.
Thanks
very much,
for
Gemma.
coming.
That's great. Cheers.
Thank you. Thanks.
If one of Lucy or Nicola can hang on, that would be really cool for a minute, just 2 minutes. I'm loath to start just removing people from the meeting.
Yeah, I'm not going to wave them. I was just going to hang on and say thanks very much for having me. So, but cheers, thank you. I'll log off now.
Thanks very much, Gemma.
That was great.
Thanks a lot. Thanks again. Cheers.
We look forward to having you in person soon.
Yeah, no, I look forward to getting there in person. I'm so determined to walk to Dornoch from Ullapool, so it's got to happen. It's got to happen.
Seriously, no.
I've got all route worked out off road. It looks lovely. There's bothies on the way. It's fine.
Yes,
anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you, Gemma.
Gemma, it's an old drove road. There's an old drove road.
Aye, yeah. Aye, magic. Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
So I don't know what happened tonight. It was really weird.
What did you not have, Ian?
So I had no audio at all when I tried to join through the website through WebEx meetings. So I came in through the app.
Yeah, I came in through the app because my little reminder thing came up and said, "Do you want to start this meeting?" So that's